Madam Speaker, death is worse than famine. We think furthermore that when Anton points to choice as the main rebuttal to this idea of responsibility, that is the exact problem in the status quo. It's that the difference between alcohol companies and beer companies and fast food restaurants is because fast food restaurants operate under the pretense that they're not doing something that's harmful, that they're not engaging in exploiting people, that they're not selling something that's addictive or habitually or chemically, and they're not trying to sell people stuff which will make them less healthy. We think that's the difference in this case. That's why we should force these people to pay for exploiting a vulnerable stakeholder who they are profiting back from. I'm going to look at two bits of rebuttal which are slightly disjointed from the rest of my speech. Then I'll look at responsibility, why we're allowed to infringe on the rights of corporations, and how this will best create broader social change and make more responsible decisions happen in consumers. The first thing that Anto talked about was that money isn't sufficient. We don't think it's entirely insufficient, but we think it is necessary to an extent. Not only are we providing some amount of money for the health costs that are borne, but there are also costs in regards to opportunity costs of being too fat to be able to go to work. That's why it's particularly important to consider that these are morbidly obese people we're talking about, who also have very high health costs, which aren't necessarily all covered under public health systems. But with that extra money, it is far easier to go to a gym because you can work less and then have more time because you have more income which is disposable. So you can not only afford to go to the gym, you can afford to work less and exercise more and get rid of your health problems in that way. You can also hire things like personal trainers and things like that. That's why compensation is beneficial. Secondly, I'm going to look at this idea of responsibility. Basically, the second difference between alcohol and fast food companies is that alcohol and the distribution of alcohol is fed by things like RSA. And everyone knows very clearly that alcohol has specific health harms. People have this veiled idea of what the health harms are with food, but it's not as clear as alcohol. But we think that when you're exploiting potentially morbidly obese people who are consuming so much, as Anto says, over tens of years, that it's basically analogous to serving someone alcohol while they are drunk and breaching RSA and basically exploiting those individuals. We think to that extent, these people have a higher burden than just giving them money and letting them, giving them food and letting them decide for themselves. Because secondly, we don't think they can. Why? Why is it an addictive thing? Anto said it was just enjoyment, that it wasn't addictive. Enjoyment is addictive. When you are habitually normalized to like something, we think you're less able to opt out of something. You never told us why enjoyment was a bad thing or wasn't coercive at all, and it is truly an element. Secondly, as Sam has already told you, there are elements of chemical addiction. So, what I'd like to say is that taste buds are malleable and your diet is malleable. When you're used and exposed to a high proportion of saturated fat content within your food, you begin to like those types of food. And those are the foods that most satisfy your stomach and most create cravings in that regard. So you begin to get normalized towards those types of unhealthy food, and that's why it's addictive to that extent. Moreover, when McDonald's offer you a $1 upsize, that normalizes you to drink a large Coke as opposed to a small Coke, when you would have been perfectly satisfied with a small Coke. We think that sort of on-the-spot pressure to buy more food for $1 is exploitative of poor people, and it means that they're more likely to start consuming more as their stomach expands more and they're able to actually eat more. We also gave you analysis about dopamine receptors and how people need more food because their receptors are increasing in their brain and the neurons change in your brain to get satisfied. That's all elements of chemical addiction which you've never dealt with. Secondly, in regards to information, it is true that information about nutrition now exists, but we are also allowing people retrospectively to sue from instances in the past where they haven't been provided with information. We think that's analogous to cigarette suits that we pointed to at first. Moreover, we think the burden should be higher than just providing some element of information which is stuck on the side of McDonald's where people don't even look. And you have these bright pictures of Happy Meals in front when you're deciding what to buy. We think the burden should be much higher, especially when the harms are there. Lastly, second to last, Anto said that these restaurants target healthy people rather than fat people. We think fat people do exist, obviously, and they do consume some amount of McDonald's. The profit incentive is there because they eat more food than skinny people. But even if they're not the majority of consumers, we think they're the most harmed, and therefore we should give that right to these morbidly obese people. The last thing I'd like to say on responsibility is this idea that you can do other things and you have opportunities to opt out. The first thing is to say is that we pointed out that at the very start of this debate as the exact perverse thing which makes this so harmful. But secondly, companies like McDonald's often hijack other things and hijack exercise, and we can see that when they sponsor things like the NRL in the late 1990s. We think that means that they take up options and basically conflate their food and their brand with healthy options. We think that's directly misrepresentative. Even if it's not legalistically bad and lying, we think that is exploiting people. At the end of that issue, I want to stress that our model basically models out most of the harms that Anton wanted to allude to. It says that you have to prove a direct causation, and if that is consistent diet at McDonald's, then those are the only people that will get compensation. But we think those people are the people who are exploited. They do exist, and they do deserve compensation, which will help them. So, thirdly, why can we impinge on the rights of corporations for social benefit? This analysis applies even if they're not entirely 100% responsible, because we think that the means to a social end should be preferred by the government. Anton said that choice would be restricted in terms of access to unhealthy food. We never necessarily thought that was an entirely bad thing, but we just thought that would lead to more information, and the people who were concerned about their health wouldn't really mind about not having access to unhealthy food. So, we think that the government and society as a whole contributes to corporations through means like financial and legal frameworks. It also allows capital investment systems, which allows these restaurants to get set up and receive investment from all other places. And the profitability of these companies is affected by broader economic state of the entire country. So we think that the governments and society as a whole contribute to the success of these people beyond the obvious thing, which is they're literally providing the citizens who are the customers which are giving over money to McDonald's. So if society contributes to these individuals, we think that that society in response can impinge on some of the rights of corporations to shape societal views on what is responsible consumption and what is healthy consumption and lifestyles. We think it, as Sam says, it flags a causal link between health harms and unhealthy food. At the moment, as I've already said in my previous substantive, the alternative means of not getting fat, such as exercise, are often hijacked by fast food corporations who recognize preemptively that there is a potential anti-marketing message there, and they need to get the first step and sponsor food and make that link, that tenuous link, which to some extent reduces the autonomy of individuals in assessing whether things are good for their health. Secondly, we think there's a slight temporal problem in terms of when you actually learn and get educated about the harms of health food, i.e. in PE in year 10. And when the majority of times when you're consuming fast food, i.e. when you're drunk and stumbling across the street and you see a McDonald's. We think that the different state of mind that you're in means that it's very hard to recognize and make that link between the actual harm of obesity, especially when, as we can see, it occurs over the long term, and the health consequences of making that choice. So, that's why we think it's necessary to, on a large and broad scale, flag that causal link so people are aware that it could lead to massive health problems, such as that are associated with morbid obesity. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that to an extent, the harms of consuming this food are hard to identify. That is the exact problem we're proud to propose.